chair panel dynamics, as well as crafting OAs and how to do that part of the process. Following that, we're going to play a video, and this is basically the feedback session. So what is going to happen is we're going to play a full debate video for all of you to track and think about it as a full oral adjudication, as if you were the chair judge of that round. And then I'll send you a Google form link where you can submit all of your scores for the speakers that you gave, as well as the oral adjudication. And then the Edge Core of NTU ODO will read through all of your feedback, all of your OAs and all of your scores, and we will send you written feedback about each of the different sections of your submissions. I'll give you more details about that later on. So let's just start with the lecture portion of this session first, and that is the discussion about crafting OAs and stuff. So let me just pull that up really quickly. All right. Just give me a second to set this up. Okay, so I can see the chat box. So if at any point you have questions, feel free to unmute and ask questions along the way, or just type it in the chat box and we can go through them there as well. If not, we can do a Q&A at the end as well to discuss any of the dynamics that are being discussed in this lecture. So a few things we're going to cover in this lecture. We're going to start with how to come to a decision at the end of a debate, the role of a chair judge, the role of a panelist and a trainee, how to craft oral adjudications, and what to think about when giving constructive feedback to teams. So let's start with coming to a decision. The important thing to remember about coming to a decision at the end of a debate is that the process shouldn't be like mind-numbing and tedious during the debate, and then all of the intellectual thinking about the debate happens at the end of it. What needs to happen is, as each speech ends, you need to be able to evaluate in that moment what the value of that speech was, and be able to evaluate as the debate progresses. So for instance, at the end of the PM-LO exchange, be able to go, okay, in this moment, is OG winning or is OO winning? And then at the end of the DPM-DLO exchange, reevaluate that to be like, okay, now that another two speeches have happened, what do I think about opening half as a whole? And then as each speech goes, continue to evaluate the larger picture. Therefore, if you need to take the extra 5 to 10 seconds between each speech to think about that and to like annotate a little bit on your paper about it, that is perfectly fine. Don't feel rushed into like going from speech to speech continuously. So use as much time as you can during the debate to evaluate as the debate progresses as well. At the end of the debate, what usually happens is that the chair will give the entire panel like 1 or 2 minutes to think about everything, to come to a conclusion, and then they will start discussing the decision. In those 2 minutes, that is not the time to first start thinking about your call. Those are the 2 minutes you use to check on your intuitions. That means that if you have an intuitive feeling, for instance, that Gov Bench is the better half of this debate, and therefore you want to give the first to OG, second to CG based on value contribution and engagement, and then the third to O and fourth to CO. During this 2 minutes is where you go back and read your notes again to make sure that your initial intuitions are right, read through their logic, read through their levels of analysis, see what kind of examples they chose, how much of it continues to stand, how much of it was engaged with well, those kinds of things. So the 2 minutes that you have at the end is not for you to make a decision, it is to confirm your decision. During these 2 minutes also is to be able to evaluate and to decide what metric you are making this decision based on, and to make that explicit. Because I think what many people tend to forget is that it is important to ensure that the criteria you use to judge one part of the debate has to be the same criteria you use to judge all of them. So for instance, if the criteria you choose to evaluate CG over OG on is value contribution, and to say that CG's value contribution to a debate is greater than OG's, then you must make sure that you also evaluate the value contribution between OO and OG and between CO and OG as well. You cannot then turn around and go, based on the value contribution CG over OG, but based on engagement OG over OO, and based on role fulfillment OO over CO. That is using multiple metrics in a single round. That is probably not fair to teams who maybe have done one of those roles better than the other. So choose a metric and stick to that metric to evaluate all 4 teams. So what you do need to do in this debate is always to think about what metric you prioritize or what metric you choose in that moment. So obviously it depends on the quality of the debate. In some debates, value contribution is fairly equal around the board, and maybe the only way you can evaluate is on level of engagement. Sometimes value contribution is good between 3 teams and it's not good between 1 team. And so you say value contribution first, therefore the team that did not value contribute comes in 4th. And then the second metric is engagement to evaluate the other 3 teams. Whatever it is, you need to decide what that metric is and be certain and clear about it. The last thing that you then need to decide in this process is to evaluate how strongly you feel about these positions. So if you think 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in a specific order, is there a certain position that you think you're not so certain on? For instance, I'm not so sure that OO should come in 3rd or 2nd, and whether CG should come in, whether CG or OO can be switched in the ranking and instead as well. Maybe those I'm not so sure about, but I'm very certain about my 1st and I'm very certain about my 4th. Having evaluated a position that way, to be able to say some positions I'm super clear about, some positions I'm not, means that you have a room for discussion in the panel to talk about what things are more important in the debate, what are the priorities for the panel to think about. So have a general idea about how you feel, how strongly you feel about your rankings as well, and why you feel that strongly, so that you have something to premise the discussion with your chair and panel based on at the second part of this. So that is coming to a decision. Hopefully, like a lot of everything else that has happened in the first 2 modules of this workshop, teach you more about how to weigh up the actual arguments. This is just the process that you need to take in that moment about actually coming to a decision. All right, once you have all of these things done, once you have a rough idea of what your personal decision is, the next step is being able to effectively use it within the panel discussion to be able to come to a compromise, to be able to have a decision at the end of the day. So the role of a chair. The first part that I want to talk about is just like the superficial role of the chair, the things that are meant to make the chair the facilitator of the room. So it's not so much about the discussion, but the individual things that the chair needs to take note of and that the chair needs to be in charge of. So obviously the welcome introductions of speakers and panelists are like the superficial parts of it, but are important just to set the impression and the tone that things are starting. Especially if you come into a debate room and, for instance, there are people in your room, the room that are friends, or that are friends with your panelists or whatever it is. There's usually a super friendly, bantery tone that starts a room. So if you start with like, welcome to the debate, this is the motion, this is your chair and panel, and do some basic introductions, it sort of brings the room to order and to give a more formal beginning to the room. Remember to do things like asking for gender pronouns depending on the tournament, whether or not those rules exist. But most tournaments, especially in the BP format now, follow the world's expectations. That means there is a request for people who do have gender pronouns to declare if they are interested to, and if they don't want to declare it, that's perfectly fine as well. But as a chair, you do have to make the statement about giving people the option to declare gender pronouns if they want to. Then obviously between each speaker, as a chair, make sure you give your panel and yourself the extra 5 or 10 seconds between each speech to think about it, but then use it carefully to thank and welcome each speaker as they come up, and to in the process of that, make sure that you also keep to the gender pronouns that people declared at the beginning of the debate. The important part of the role of the chair is actually these next two things. One is to be in charge of the room and to have the full control and the order of the room. And for the most part, the things that chairs tend to do fairly well is things like making sure speeches are timed and all of those things. But one of the important parts of it is being able to wave down POIs that take longer than 15 seconds, being able to wave down speakers who try and POI outside of the unprotected time, making sure that noise levels are low so that chair judges or judges don't get distracted by conversations happening outside of the main speech. And more importantly, now in the era of online debating, making decisions about internet connections. So if a speaker cuts off in the middle of a speech, how to respond to that, how long to wait for that, whether or not to carry on, or whether or not to give speakers the time to restart their speeches, are all decisions that a chair judge gets to make. I'm inclined to think that the easier or the more standardized option should be to stop the timer, let the person reconnect, restart, and then like start the timer where they left off the last time. But again, depends on tournament to tournament. The chair makes the call in the room for these things. The second part then is guiding the post-debate discussion with your panelists. We'll talk more about this in a bit, about how this panel discussion should go and what you need to do about it. But after the panel discussion is over, you then give the oral adjudication, the constructive feedback, submit feedback on your panelists and trainees. And I think the important thing to remember is that when you are allocated to be a chair judge, you are there as you are seen as someone important enough to have control of the room. You're probably a senior figure of the community. You are there to give feedback and advice, not just to the teams on how they can improve speeches better, but you're also there to provide educational value for the trainees in the room and to help the judges on your panel become better judges as well. So make sure that the environment or the atmosphere you provide to judges is not hostile, that you're not there to antagonize them or bully them into certain decisions, but you're there to make sure that they understand the position you're coming from and that they learn from you, but also that you learn from them, because remember that judging is fairly fluid because it's a game of persuasion and different people are persuaded by different things. So there is no real right answer that is absolutely correct in judging, and you have to be able to be fluid and be able to discuss and adapt to the panel that is put with you. All right, so let's talk about what exactly the panel discussion should look like. The important thing about the post-debate discussion with your panelists is that hopefully what happens in the discussion is an actual analysis about the debate that has happened in front of you. So the first things first is to always be inclusive of all panelists' opinions. And this means both in terms of taking in parts of what your panelists are saying that maybe you didn't think about or that you didn't previously consider or wasn't something that people or that wasn't something that registered on your radar when you thought about it. So use your panelists to your advantage to fill your blind spots or to fill the areas that you maybe didn't see. But also in terms of like in positions where you maybe disagree with your panelists, maybe you disagree with the position or the viewpoint in which your panelist comes from, to be able to actively respond to and engage with those situations and analyze why you were persuaded or not persuaded by it, even though your panelist was or wasn't as well. I think the important thing to remember here is that as a chair, even though you are technically the more senior person on the panel, it is not your job or it is not your role to overwhelm the panelists' decision and to just tell them, oh no, that is wrong, here's what the right answer is. That is not how panel discussions should go. And the point is to engage with the panelists and to discuss what the situation with that ranking is. Because many a times chairs do end up dismissing panelists' opinion and saying, well, that's not how it goes. This is what the right answer is. And that's not how panelist discussions should go. The second thing and more important thing that like is connected to that is that there needs to be an awareness from the perspective of a chair that this cannot go on forever as well. That you cannot, like, as much as you want to engage with the panelists and deal with what the panelists' opinions are, that at some point we as humans who are listening to what is happening and interpreting the debate as it happens, we tend to lose track of what things were explicitly said in the debate versus what are the things that we implicitly read from the content of the speakers in the debate. And that's an important differentiation that happens when we need to decide whether or not certain arguments had persuasive value. So be always aware of and obvious and thinking about whether or not the comparisons that are being made between things explicitly said in the debate or between things that were implicitly read from what was said in the debate. And those are things that will help you decide whether or not something is more valuable in the round. The thing with how tournaments function is that you have only 15 minutes to have this entire deliberation. And yes, sometimes debates are hard to call and they're complicated and complex and people have multi-layered different opinions about all the different calls and it's difficult. However, because of the time limits that are placed on how judging works, you have to manage time in that 15 minutes very, very carefully. This means, for instance, putting a stopwatch up to time each section of the 15 minutes that you have and being able to move from one section of the discussion to the next and just know when to end the discussion, especially when if you realize that the two judges are just not seeing eye to eye, there is just no constructive resolution to what is happening. And in that situation, it is a lot easier as a chair to just say, all right, this discussion is not going to lead anywhere. We're not actually going to make any decisions based on this. Let's just take a vote. And the voting process should always be the last resort, but should be used if time becomes a problem and we need to make a decision fast. When calling for a vote, I think it's important to recognize that this is not a vote, or for most situations, this is not a vote on the entire ranking. So for instance, you probably do agree on what the first and the fourth should be, and there is a disagreement on who should get second and who should get third. In that scenario, take a vote on that, and that is the part that gets decided based on the vote, but everything else is still consensus or unanimous. Obviously, if the differentiation is like, I think this team should come in first and you think they should come in fourth, then that sounds like the whole debate will get taken to a vote. In that scenario, if you are the chair that's in the minority, please don't give the oral adjudication. I think the likely situation is just like give someone in the majority the OA rights to give the OA. But if you still are on board with two rankings and you're only in the minority of one of those rankings, I'm likely inclined to think that it's easier if you just give the OA for the whole debate and then explain that the vote happened to the debater so that they can get feedback from the other two panelists about that ranking as well. So remember, the maximum time limit for deliberations is 15 minutes at most tournaments. Some tournaments might give you 20 minutes. So manage that time well. Remember also, and I think a lot of chairs tend to forget this, that the 15 to 20 minutes that's given to you includes things like scoring, submitting of the feedback, and those kinds of things. So don't just have a 15-minute discussion and then at the end of that 15-minute go, okay, now give me another 3-4 minutes to fill in the ballot and to figure out scoring, because include all of that in the 20 minutes when you're making that discussion. All right. So that is post-debate discussion with the panelists. So let's just look at how this works from the panelist perspective, because I think that from the chair's perspective, it's a bit, it is a lot of things to juggle as a chair but it's also a bit easier because as a chair judge, you're likely to be more experienced and you're likely to have done this a lot more often. Therefore, it gets more reflexive as to how it should go. But I think from the perspective of a panelist, it's maybe a bit different. So the role of a panelist. So there are a few things that are crucial for panelists. The first is definitely have a clear decision for yourself before engaging in the discussion with the chair. I know of a lot of panelists who sort of jump in at the end of the debate to immediately be like, let's discuss the call. And then when asked what their call was, go, I'm not so sure. I think maybe OG first, but I don't know anything else. Those are not productive discussions about within a panel, because there is no real opinion that you're formed about the debate yet, and you're sort of just forming an opinion based on what the chair's opinion is. That is not a fruitful or productive way to be a panel member at any point. So make sure you have a clear decision for yourself before engaging in discussion with your chair. If you think you need an extra minute, if you think you need to like take the extra time to form a better decision, please do ask the chair for that extra time to make that call. Again, obviously, the way up there is that the more time you take individually to take your own call is less time to have the larger group discussion, which is why I said earlier in this lecture to not wait for evaluating this till the end of the debate, to do that at the point of each speech happening, so that by the end of the debate, it is much easier for you to make the call and you are less likely to waste the 15-minute time span at the end in making the call. The next thing to remember as a panelist is that even though you are technically seen as like the second level judge, because the chair is the top tier judge and then the panelist is the second tier judge, that you are not inferior in any way in quality to the chair. So don't just buckle to whatever the chair says. Don't just say, okay, if the chair says so, that must be right. So be confident in what you have to put forward as a panelist, what your opinions of the evaluations are, what you were persuaded by, what you were not persuaded by. Make sure that you participate as much as possible in the process. In some situations, in some dire, hopefully not as often situations, chairs tend to forget that panelists are an important part of the discussion, and they sort of like zoom in, focus on writing their own oral adjudication and their own rankings. So make sure as a panelist, you make your voice heard, that you make sure that the entire panel, including the chair judge, understands your perspective of the ranking, and don't just sit there and listen to other people talk, for instance, but to make sure that your voice is heard as well. On that note, make sure that you don't get bullied into changing your rankings. So there are occasionally situations where chairs will say, I have more experience in judging. I know that this is wrong. This is the right ranking. Don't worry about it. And they sort of just like dismiss panelists. Do not allow chairs to do that. Make sure you stand up for your decisions and your view of the debate. Make sure it's clear to the chair that you disagree on certain rankings, or you see the debate in a different perspective, or have a different evaluation of what was persuasive in the round. Having said that, don't be stubborn about it either, because again, remember that in the 15-minute deliberation that you have, you don't have the time, the luxury of time to have a full-on discussion about the persuasive value of each and every argument in the debate. But also at the same time, as humans in general, we are not perfect, and therefore we all have our blind spots or our lack of perfect tracking ability, which means we will tend to miss certain arguments or miss certain examples here or there. So definitely listen to what the rest of your panel has to say, listen to what the trainees have to say, what the chair has to say. And if it is something that you can agree to, maybe you missed something or saw something from a different perspective, and if you think that that is a legitimate thing that could have happened in the debate, then don't be stubborn about holding on to your rankings. Do compromise, sort of, and be able to make those compromising or adapting calls with your chair. The important thing to remember, I think, here, and I want to like quickly talk about trainees a little bit in the same line, because all of these things fall in line with trainees as well, because trainees also are supposed to be a part of the larger discussion and are supposed to be involved in the process. That sometimes we tend to treat trainees like as if they don't matter in the room because, well, they don't have a vote, because that's how trainees work, that if you come to a vote, the trainee's vote doesn't count. But the important thing to remember about being a trainee is that even though you are there for the educational value of the round and you're there to learn how to judge and you're there to become a better judge, the part of the process to becoming a better judge and the part of the process to being a trainee is to be an active part of the process and to have input and to make sure that your voice is heard on the situation, to do the like 50-50 job of judging, which is 50% listening to the rest of your panel and making evaluations based on what the rest of your panel and the rest of your chair say, and also the other 50%, which is to be vocal and to make your voice and your stance of it heard, even though technically you are seen as the trainee. And I think this is a harder job for a trainee than for a panelist, because for a panelist, it's a lot easier to just be like, hey, I have a voting right on this panel, please listen to what I'm saying. But for a trainee, it's a lot harder to break that barrier sometimes, because chairs tend to like consider trainees as less important in the discussion. Therefore, it is more likely for trainees' voice to get drowned out in the discussion, even though trainees have the ability to sometimes say something that might actually change the course of the entire discussion and to change some of the rankings. So as a trainee, make sure you do as much as you can to be as vocal as you can and to break past that barrier that sometimes chairs like subconsciously have about trainees, and make sure that your voice is heard clearly. Part of that is making sure that you have a clear vision of what the ranking is, have a clear vision of what you found persuasive and why, and then go from there. So the last thing then is, as a panelist or trainee, just because you are not the one crafting your oral adjudication does not mean that you shouldn't also plan for what that oral adjudication should look like. I think you should also start thinking about how you compare a lot of these things and how you would explain it to the teams. This includes things like making sure that you have individual feedback and constructive feedback for the teams as well as for the individual speakers. So a lot of times what teams tend to do, especially if you look at tournaments like Worlds, is that teams tend to go to any member of the panel, including the trainees, for feedback. So make sure you have constructive feedback that you can give to teams and to judges. We'll talk about what constructive feedback looks like in a bit, but always think about how you can help the speakers become better as well. Even if you're just a panelist or trainee, you have just as much of a role in sort of being the educators in the room, in telling teams what they could or could not have done better. So definitely have feedback ready for all of the 4 teams in the round. So that's just like in terms of expected roles. If anyone has any questions now, this is the time to maybe ask before I go into like crafting OAs and feedback.
I was curious, how do you take the major steps when the 15-minute discussion happens? Like,
Sorry, can you repeat that again?
of course, it cannot be black and white answer. What do you think that the major steps during the 15-minute discussion, like main things to cover?
So I think within that 15-minute discussion, what should be prioritized is deciding a metric for ranking. So for instance, like in the first, if you say, let's say you take the first 2 minutes to think about checking your intuitions and checking your decision and all of those things, by minute 3.5 to 4, you should be able to have an idea of what everyone on the panel's rankings are. That means the next 5 minutes is just a discussion of what those placing of rankings look like. I think the important part of that, as discussed earlier, is to decide what metric you are using to judge the debate on. So if the metric is value contribution, then like make that discussion clear with the rest of the panel. And then at that point, it's a lot easier to decide, okay, which argument is more important, which rebuttal is more important, because we have a metric to judge the round by. Then of course, like take the last few minutes to do scoring and whatever it is. So I think the main stance to function on is to just decide what metric you're judging the debate based on and then go from there. Yeah. Okay, any other questions before we go into like crafting OAs? I think if you want to jump in at any point, feel free, okay?
No, I'm good. It sounds very comprehensive. I think the only thing I would want to say is that panelists and trainees, you are actually encouraged to ask your chair for feedback after the round in the same way that speakers are encouraged to ask their chair for feedback after the round, because then your chair and can give you additional information on how to structure your ideas more clearly after the and how to contribute more efficiently to the discussion. So that might also be quite helpful. So do ask your chairs for feedback, especially if you're going to a competition.
Yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
I just sorry, I just want to ask, is there anything additional that you might want to add if we are solo chairing, for example?
I actually think if you're solo chairing, a lot of this doesn't matter anymore because the chair, like the dynamics of how to compromise or adapt the ranking doesn't matter. The point of the 15-minute buffer given to you in that time is to basically just craft your oral adjudication and fill out the speaker ballot. So use the 15 minutes to fully like evaluate the persuasive value of all the arguments, craft how you make the OA, and then fill in the ballot, because all of the problems about adapting to different persuasive instincts across 3 people on the panel no longer matter. Yeah. So all the things that we talked about what chairs need to do is still a thing. They just no longer have to evaluate like the dynamics of the panel as well. So you have more time on your hands.
All right, thank you.
Sure. All right, let's go into crafting oral adjudication specifically then. So this is what is on the screen right now is an incredibly vague template that I tend to use when giving oral adjudications, just so that there is a form and a structure to the oral adjudication that is easy to follow. So obviously each chair has their own variation of what this oral adjudication looks like, whatever is comfortable to you. I think the important thing to remember about an oral adjudication is clarity. So much in the way that debate speech is better off if there are more labels and there's more signposting and there's more structure and flow, that is also true of an oral adjudication. So make sure that there is clarity in the order in which you're doing this oral adjudication and in the things that you emphasize as being important in the round. So let me just run you through how I would give an oral adjudication, and then we can talk about what the other like variations of this are. So what I normally would start with is a quick like courtesy call thing to just sort of say, welcome back, thank you for the round, it was a good round. Those kinds of things to set a formal tone to the start of the OA. Then give the teams a rundown of what is going to happen in this oral adjudication. So say, I will give you general comments, then the decision, and then justify them, and then we can go into personal feedback, sort of like a verbal contents page of what this OA is going to be. And then start with general comments. And I think general comments are sometimes overlooked in rounds. So there are two things that happen, both of which are the two extremes and both are problematic. One is when you have zero comments about the debate in general and you jump straight to the call. The second is to spend a good 5 minutes going through a sort of little rant about the debate as part of your general comments. Both of these things are bad strategies to an oral adjudication. What general comments should look like are 1 or 2 key bullet points that you think are important for all of the speakers in the room. Things like this debate could have used more direct engagement on arguments, or this debate could have had more characterization on who the main actors in the debate are, because it made the rest of the debate harder to evaluate without this characterization. Simple, easy to understand, one-liner general comments that are applicable to all of the speakers in the room and are applicable to how the debate functioned as a whole. I think this is valuable because it sort of frames how the rest of the oral adjudication goes from there, to be able to explain to the teams what kinds of limitations their speeches placed on the persuasive value of the debate as a whole. So definitely start with 1 or 2 general comments, hopefully. If you have none, I think that's okay, but preferably you have at least 1 or 2 things to say about what the general theme of the debate felt like. And then give the decision. I think the important thing about the decision is to make sure that you don't confuse teams in how you give it. So I know of some judges who like to give rankings based on house positions. So to be able to say, OG came in third, OO came in first, CG came in second, and CO came in fourth. That is confusing to track a lot of the times. I think it is easier to start with first, second, third, fourth by rankings and calling out house names. So for instance, the first goes to CG, the second goes to OO, the third goes to OG, and the fourth goes to CO. It's a lot easier to track and understand verbally because the people whom you're speaking to do not see the cross house diagram that's on your paper. And therefore, it's a lot harder to visualize what you're talking about if you don't go by order of rank. So always go in order of rank, and then say first goes to who, second goes to who, third goes to who, fourth goes to who. Following that, you then go into the actual justification for why this is true. And I think what many judges tend to do in this situation is to sort of just start by talking about what each team did. So CG did the following few things. This was good, this was bad. OG did the following few things. This was good, this was bad. While that is useful in terms of understanding how the judge evaluated the persuasive value of the content of the team, it doesn't weigh out anything. So the important thing about oral adjudications is to compare 2 teams at a time, to be able to say why third ranked over fourth, why second ranked over third, and why first over second. What I usually do is to start with just the team that came in fourth first, to just talk about why the team came in fourth and what the flaws of the team that came in fourth were, what are the good things the team that came in fourth did, and then to be able to go, okay, considering that premise, what did the team that came in third do to be better than what the team that came in fourth did? And then explain the third over fourth ranking, and then do second over third, and then first over second. I think the important thing to remember here is that while this is the best template that I can think of to be clear to teams about it, you must also remember that sometimes teams want to know how they stood up against the 2 other teams in the room as well. So this often happens, especially with teams that come in fourth. A lot of times they will say, okay, we agree that the team that came in third did better than us, therefore we should come behind them. But we disagree that we lost to the other 2 teams that came in first and second. So think about when evaluating the teams, not just the third over fourth, second over third, but also what the other 2 teams in the room did in comparison to that team as well. So when evaluating teams, I would say prioritize the ranking just above them. So for instance, let's say CG came in fourth and CO came in third. It is important to prioritize the description of why CO over CG. But while evaluating that, also be able to talk about why, in general, the opening half did better than the closing half, so that there is a comparison as to why the team that came in fourth lost to all the 3 other teams and not just this one team that you're comparing to. Then move on to why second over third, why OO over CO. That's where you talk a lot more details about why opening in general did better than closing, what OO did better than CO did, what CO's main problems were. And then when you compare the opening half, you can talk about OG over OO, for instance, and discuss what opening half was. But then in particular, at the end of that ranking, be able to say what the team that came in first did that was better than all the other 3 teams in the room, so that there is a direct comparison between 2 teams at all times in all directions. At the end of this oral adjudication, where you have compared all 4 teams to each other, make sure that you give teams the chance, so give a conclusion and then give teams the chance to come to you and ask for more information about this OA, one, and then for personal feedback, two. So what usually happens, especially at big tournaments like Worlds, where they also give you a cap for how long your oral adjudication can be. For instance, that you must only deliver your oral adjudication in 15 minutes because the next round is happening, is that sometimes the oral adjudication tends to be a little too fast and too vague, and teams have a bunch of questions about how you weight one thing over the other, how you weight one team over the other. I think this is the opportunity to then like talk while you walk back to the debate venue, or talk while waiting for the next round to start, where you elaborate in a lot more detail how you weighed up one team over the other. So definitely, again, I think watch time management, watch the clock, follow the instructions that the OPCOM or the Edge Core give you about this timing, and decide how much information to include in the OA based on that timing, and then make yourself available for more details about the discussion at the end of it. Yeah, that's for oral adjudication. If you have questions about oral adjudication, feel free to ask now.
When you decide on a metric to use to judge a debate, right? So let's say for the long cross, there is like they are talking about different things, so they are not really like engaging with one another. Does that mean that you cannot use engagement as a metric to judge the entire debate?
No, I actually will think that if they didn't engage with one another, engagement is at that point a metric to make a decision based on. So for instance, if there is a lot of engagement between OG and OO, and a lot of engagement between CG and CO, but no engagement in the cross houses, then you rank based on that. The fact that there is a lack of engagement is also a reason to lower the rank of a team compared to another as well.
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about oral adjudication or anything else so far before we go into feedback?
Maybe I would just jump in real
Yeah.
quick to talk about that engagement thing.
Yeah.
So the first thing I want to say is that when you have metrics to judge a debate on, try to always use the metrics provided by the teams first before bringing in your own metrics. So I think Amrit went through this in her lecture on day one. And I think I said this a little bit as well, but basically, if all teams agree that something is important in the round, then use as your metric whether that particular thing that they all agreed was important. If none of the teams explicitly agree, you can still use what they implicitly agree to be important. And if none of them implicitly agree that something is important, you can then default to the metric that one team has successfully shown to be important. But you should only bring in your own metrics for judging the round at the point when all of these other metrics brought by the teams have been not happening. So that's about just the criteria of using engagement as a metric in the first place. And the second thing about looking at engagement as a metric is that it's also down to you to consider all the preemptive material, especially in a long diagonal. So if you're talking about something like engagement between opening government and closing opposition, you do have to note that opening government actually just can't respond to whatever closing opposition is saying. So you need to also look at all the preemptive engagement that was there before considering how all the material interacted. So it's not about looking at engagement like as an absolute. It's about looking at how much the arguments engaged with each other and then determining who won the arguments based on that, rather than looking at how much teams chose to engage or teams chose not to engage. Look at the argument interaction rather than engagement.
I see. Thank you.
Sorry, give me a second. Sorry, can you all hear me? Okay, great. Okay, the last thing then we want to talk about is constructive feedback. And I think the important thing to remember about constructive feedback is that the more specific you can get, the more useful your feedback is. So some potential areas of feedback that you can give them is things like time management, prioritization of issues, content, engagement, structure. I think the thing to remember, especially at tournaments, is that you don't want to end up sounding like you are giving people a lecture on the issue. So yes, sometimes content information is useful to teach people how to deal with such motions in the future, or information that could be useful in other debates. But especially in the setting of, say, a major competition, most speakers don't have the ability or capacity to take in too much content feedback. So while you can give them some basic information like, hey, did you know about XYZ happening? That could have been a good example for the debate. Or if you had contextualized for this group of stakeholders because all of these things are happening, maybe that would have been useful. Try not to focus too much of your feedback specified on content. Prioritize things that they can apply immediately in the next round. So it will look like things like time management. It will look like things like value and quality of rebuttal. It will look like prioritization of argumentation. It will look like strategy and structure. It will look like phrasing of POIs, or when POIs are asked, or how often POIs are asked. These are kinds of things that teams can immediately take in and use literally in the next round. If you give them feedback that is entirely centered on the content of their speeches, that is not something they can immediately use in the next round, even though it might be useful for some future time where this debate is relevant. So choose the kind of feedback you prioritize in giving to being something they can immediately use in the next round. The second thing to say is to be very specific about the feedback. So don't make vague claims like you could have engaged better or have better time management. So definitely point to the sections of your speeches and say, in this part of your speech, you said X. Maybe if you had phrased it as Y, it would have been more persuasive because there are more examples there, or maybe there is more analysis done there. Or maybe if you had not made this analysis, you would have had the time to fulfill this other piece of analysis that was more important. So point to specific parts of the speech and be able to identify what was specifically wrong in that area in the feedback that you give. Don't just give generic platitudes about what should or should not have been done. This is important because I think if you sound super vague and give generalized statements about the feedback, it hurts your credibility as a judge because it almost feels like you didn't really evaluate the specificities of the speech. So definitely give as much detailed feedback as you can to the team. But if you have no feedback, for instance, the team is an excellent team, it's a really, really good speech, you don't have any specific feedback to give to them, or you can't think of anything that you would have done differently or that you would have thought of differently, it is entirely legitimate to tell teams that. Do not pretend to have feedback for a team that you actually thought the speech was very good and you don't have any particular feedback for them, because debaters can tell when you are lying and making things up as you go along, or when you are unsure of what you are saying, because you will have a tell. So it is entirely legitimate to just tell teams, I actually don't have that much feedback from you. Here is maybe 1 point, but for the most part, I liked everything that you did, because you don't want to come across as pretending like you know something that you do not. So only give feedback that you are sure is valuable to the teams, and make sure that it is important for the teams to know what you're saying about this particular thing. Otherwise, just don't give them feedback at all. The value of feedback, and specifically constructive feedback, is an educational value. So again, when we started this lecture, I talked about the fact that chair judges are there to be the educators of the room, to be able to give an educational mindset to the speakers, to be able to teach them about their speeches, but to also teach the panelists and the trainees about judging. Make sure that you have that mindset in terms of providing an environment where you teach people things. Therefore, obviously, if you don't know enough about the content, or if you don't know anything about the round, don't pretend to educate on something that you don't have the information on. Just give them information that is valuable for the round or valuable for the next round, and make sure that you give them certain specific advice that is useful for the round that they will have in the future. The other thing to remember about constructive feedback, and I think this is something that many teams or many judges tend to blend the two on, is that it is much better to make sure that your constructive feedback and your oral adjudication are two very separate things. And I know of a lot of judges who will say in their oral adjudication, I didn't believe this premise, but because or I know that this premise is not true, but because no one rebutted it and it stayed in the debate, I evaluated it as being legitimate. Or to say things like, I know for a fact that there is context in this that is untrue because of my specialized knowledge, but this is what eventually happened in the debate. What happens in that situation is that you come across as having stepped into the debate to make evaluative decisions based on specialized knowledge or based on things that should not be a criteria in judging. Instead, what is a lot easier is if you didn't say those things in oral adjudication, but instead said it in feedback. So in constructive feedback, you can say, hey, remember this thing that I evaluated as being viable in the debate? Here is the reality for why this argument is not viable. Here is some information about why this is unlikely to be true. So make sure you split your oral adjudication and constructive feedback into two very clear separate parts, so that what happens in constructive feedback is not evaluated as how you made the decision in the oral adjudication. Constructive feedback is purely for what debaters should have done. Oral adjudication is for what they did do. And those are two very separate things that you should not like mix with one another or blend into one another.
Excuse me, I just want to ask, because sometimes I find it quite hard to draw the line between like what I know as myself versus like the average reasonable voter kind of thing. So for example, would the average reasonable voter be someone who understands, like, despite this is what, like for example, like media portrayal of certain communities, right? But I myself understand that there is a nuance here, and like for example, media has a certain agenda behind it. So would that constitute as me stepping into the debate, or something that the average voter would know as is?
I think at any point that you are saying the media generally portrays something, but you know the nuance, that is stepping in. Because that is you perpetuating something that is not general knowledge. And I think the important thing to remember about the average reasonable voter is not what you know, but what you think the majority of society will know, right? So if the majority of society, based on say their knowledge from newspaper headings or from the general media view, which might maybe skew slightly liberal, is this particular perpetuation or portrayal of a certain group of people, then any sort of nuance that you know from your specialized reading is automatically not the average reasonable voter. So that's exactly what I mean by saying you can tell teams this nuance in constructive feedback, but you cannot use it to evaluate whether or not an argument is persuasive in and of itself.
Maybe I'll just add in some things about the average reasonable person. The first thing to note is that debating is quite international, especially now that we are on online tournaments. So what you might think is common knowledge in one country may not actually be common knowledge in another country. That's super important. That's why the standard for average reasonable person is that people should know what's generally been in international headlines for a sustained period of time, like international headlines of of newspapers that are fairly like wide reaching. So that's like pretty important to just keep in mind, because you might end up judging around where something is just very, very common knowledge in your region, but simply not common knowledge at all in another region. And unless it's made international headlines, I think it is a bit unfair to expect all teams from all over the world to have that exact same knowledge. So that's the standard criteria of average reasonable person that's given in the WDC judging manual. The second thing to note here is that teams should do the work of making those characterizations for you, meaning they can't just assume that everybody in the round has that area of specialized knowledge either. So if they give a piece of specialized knowledge and they don't explain it, even if it's what you know to be true, you do have to also note that they are dropping specialized knowledge without necessarily giving all the explanation for it. And I think that might be important to note as well, which you can tell them in feedback. Like if somebody just came in and dropped a speech that was full of straight up economics jargon, without explaining any of the jargon, I think that would be a bit less persuasive as well, because none of that jargon was necessarily explained. The third thing to note about the average reasonable person is that, as Viha said, please don't bring your specialized knowledge into the round when you are giving your reason for decision, but please also feel free to bring it in as feedback, because that feedback is going to be important. But if you come into a round and a team has given a piece of analysis that rests on a premise that is absolutely unreasonable, so something that literally every average reasonable person would know to be untrue, it doesn't mean that you can automatically dismiss it. Okay, don't automatically dismiss and say, okay, auto false. It just means they now have a much higher argumentative burden of proof, because now they must show why their premise, which is unintuitive to most average reasonable people, should be the premise upon which their argument can be built. So a specific piece of knowledge or an unintuitive read of average reasonable knowledge raises the argumentative burden for the team that's using it, but doesn't necessarily knock them out of the round. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Just one last thing to add to that, I think is so this probably doesn't work in a solo chair situation, but I also think lean on the rest of your panel and your trainees to help check your average reasonable intuitions as well. To be able to just be like, is this specific nuance something that is specific to me and my understanding of the situation, or is this something that can be counted as average reasonable voter perspective? If every single person on your panel and trainee also believe that this is something that is general information that everyone around the world should know, then maybe it is part of the average reasonable voter intuition. But if every other person on the panel is like, no, that's not something we knew, or that's not something that we can count because it was on this one niche newspaper or something like that, then you have a sort of check and balance to check whether or not you're reading too much into specific characterizations. So definitely use the panel discussion, especially for things like this as well. Yeah, okay, are there any more thoughts, questions about OA's feedback and chair panel dynamics in general? If not, we'll go into the next section of this session. All right, the next section, what's going to happen is we're going to play you a full demo debate video. What we would like is for you to track this debate as a whole and basically be a solo chair for yourself, come up with a full oral adjudication as well as speaker scores for all of the speakers in the round. I will send you the link to a Google form. I think actually it might be here. Yeah, that Google form is right at the bottom, the tinyurl.com/NTOA submissions. Send your full submission to that link. What we'll do is we will keep that link open for the weekend. So at the end of the weekend, Sunday night, we will close the form. What Enting and I will do, Enting, Amrit and I will do is we will split all of the submissions that come in and we will email you written feedback on your oral adjudication, as well as your scoring, as well as your rankings that you gave, so that you can get personal feedback about your oral adjudications and you can learn from that as well. Are there any questions about how that process works?
Where can we find the rubrics for the scoring? Can we Google it or
So if
something?
you Google it, you want to look for Warsaw, WARSAW, EUDC speaker scale.
Sorry, Warsaw, what?
Warsaw, EUDC speaker scale.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that is the motion that's on the screen is the motion of the demo debate video as well. So do take note of that motion. I will post it in the Zoom chat as well if you need it for later while the video is playing.
Viha, there's a typo in the motion. It's police commanders.
Oh, right. I copied this off the screen in the video.
Okay, I might have made that screen wrong.
Also, I had a question in general about like online debating. So since in an instance that I am a panelist in a room, and like particularly my internet connection is like I get disconnected, then like can I like ask the speakers to repeat like 2 minutes of the speech again or something?
Generally, that would depend on the tournament's rules. Like most tournaments will release some kind of technical guide before the tournament happens, which gives exact instructions for what to do in these situations. If you are, I think the general idea is if you are disconnected for a short period of time and all you need to do is get them to repeat like the last 2 sentences, that's fine. I think asking them to repeat the last 2 minutes of their speech is probably a little bit excessive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right. I hope that video was audible and you're all able to track that. What is going to happen now is that we are going to share with you the link for the Google form where you can submit your full oral adjudication scores, feedback that you, constructive feedback, that kind of thing. And we will email you the feedback that the EdgeCore has for your written submission within the week. What we're going to do is we're going to leave this Google form open for the weekend. So if you need time to craft it, because we recognize that typing out or writing out an oral adjudication is a lot harder or more time consuming than actually crafting a verbal oral adjudication. So we're going to give you the time to have to write out and craft your OA as well, and then type it into the Google form and send it to us. And then over the next few days, next few weekdays, Enting, Amrit, and I will read through your submissions and send you the feedback for it. The link is here again, tinyurl.com/NTOA submission. Does anyone have any questions about what is happening in the next step? Or any questions about judging in general, maybe after the video?
Hi, I have a question on judging, although it's not on like British parliamentary judging, but like for 3v3 formats, right? How much weight should be given to like style of speakers?
So I do think that there is no metric per se for style specifically, but you think of style in the capacity of how persuasive the argument was for you. So consider it as a holistic category of style and content and strategy put together in your decision making to determine whether an argument was persuasive. So obviously things like a speaker speaking too fast to track is technically in the other types of format a style problem, but in the BP format might just be something that is difficult to help you understand what they're trying to say and therefore make the persuasive value of an argument lesser so. So don't think of style as a separate category of its own. Style is sort of integrated with how you evaluate content as well.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add on to that, don't double count style. Style is only valuable insofar as it makes your content easier to understand. So you cannot credit a team for good content and then additionally credit them on top of that saying, oh, but that the style on that was so good, because presumably you are already taking style into account when you're crediting how persuasive the content was.
Okay, is this only applicable to like British parliamentary or like 3v3 formats also?
So I think it depends on the 3v3 format. I think in the WSDC style, style is a separate category of its own from content, and therefore there's some attempt at evaluating it separately. But if you think of AP, Asian parliamentary in Austros, I think it is a similar principle. Style is not a separate metric of its own. It counts towards how persuasive the content in and of itself is.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if there are none, I think, Sam, you want to do some closing things, right?
Yep, just a couple. Give me a second, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I just want to like say three quick things to like sort of wrap up, because this does bring us to the end of our 3-module judging workshop. So firstly, we've recorded all 3 sessions. So if anyone wants to rescind consent, they can be edited out of the videos at any point. So like before or after the video, because these videos are likely to be put up on YouTube and Facebook in the near future. Secondly, thank you all for coming, and I hope you've learned something about judging BPs. So we do have a short Google form set up for feedback. I'm not going to send it on the chat here, so I'll add it in on the email sent to you all about like submitting some feedback to be judged for the OA, because I don't want it to take away from that. But and it'll be like that'll be active for like quite a long time after like the deadline for submitting your OAs to be judged by Viha and the rest of the Adj core. So but do please fill in the feedback form, because it'll help give us insight into like what people are looking for future tournaments, not limited to NTU or ODO. And lastly, there's just a few people that we need to thank here, and I'll do that quickly, as well as on the Facebook posts that go up regarding this set of workshops. Firstly, as the organizing committee, and on behalf of the organizing committee, I want to thank the Adj core of NTU Audio. So that's Amrit, Enting, Lee, and Viha for actually making this possible. Secondly, like everyone who agreed to debate for us in these teaching videos. So everyone you saw in the debate in module 2 with the directives, as well as this one. And lastly, Beiqi for her invaluable help in setting up the content of this workshop. And I think that's about it. So if there's nothing else, Viha, I think we can just tell everyone to enjoy the rest of their weekend. And then, of course, you can like feel free to leave the call on. We hope to see you at NTU ODO. Yeah.
Yep, that's about it. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you guys, most of you at NTU ODO in various capacities, especially those of you who are judging as well.
Yeah. All right. Have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye.